Oil having its best day of the year today, but doesn't say a whole lot because yesterday it had its worst day in nearly 30 years. But this is the question everybody wants to know the answer to. What exactly happened that caused the Russians and the Saudis to take their oil barrels and go home and send oil and the markets literally into the tank? RBC's Helima Croft was not only at the OPEC meeting where it happened, but also was with the Saudis over the weekend. She joins us now by phone. Helima, I can't believe I missed the meeting, but I'm glad you were there. What the heck happened?
I think what happened was essentially the Russians said no deal. The Saudis were looking, as you noted, a 1.5 million barrel a day production cut. That required the Russians to kick in an extra 300,000 barrels. Now, the Russians have not been fully complying with their previous OPEC commitment. They were not going to give up any additional barrels, and Saudi basically said, if you're not going to play ball, we're going home. And then you had the Russian oil minister leave the building and essentially say, from April 1, every producer could do whatever they wanted, and that's when the market started to be concerned about being flooded with oil.
Who drove, in your mind, and you're there watching this, getting insight, who drove the split? It's not you, it's me.
I really do think that everybody was expecting the Russians to give in at the end. This is what's been happening since 2016. The Russians always say it's going to be difficult, always say they may not do it, and always show up. This was the time when the Russians finally said no deal. And there are reports that Igor Sechin, the powerful CEO of Rosneft, really drove that decision. He was essentially like, why should we give another lifeline to shale? Make those shale companies balance the market. And frankly, I don't want to hear any more about American energy abundance. I'm tired of these sanctions that the U.S. can do without any pain because of all this oil. So I think Sechin was very focused on the U.S. In some respects, Sechin has become the new Naimi. He's the one essentially saying, let the high-cost producer of the United States balance this market.
So ultimately, Helima, there's a case here where, and the Russians they're great chess players, and they think a couple moves down the board. Also, the geopolitics of Russia's role in the Middle East, and for that matter in Latin America and Venezuela, continues to evolve, and it continues to be very strategic for Putin. Can you talk about any of that? Because I think you look at the chess pieces. I agree this is, U.S. shale breaks even at $50 free cash flow, and we're nowhere near there, so this is painful. But it's also geopolitics.
You're absolutely right. Traditionally, we've thought about Russia and OPEC privileging the deals they're cutting in the Middle East. There's better relations in Latin America, in Africa. This has been a vehicle for soft power gains for Russia. An oil deal has become a trade deal. But that was one set of actors in Russia pushing an argument. On the flip side, again, you have to look at Igor Sechin. He has said from the beginning that Russia should not cooperate with OPEC. He's been very focused on wanting to maximize volume because of the tax structure. He gets more gains the more barrels he puts on the market. And his big geopolitical argument is American energy abundance is bad for Russia because the United States can sanction everybody. We just sanctioned Rosneft trading, and we don't pay the price at the pump. So I think it is geopolitical and economic for Sechin, and I think that's where we stand right now. If the Russians decide to cave in and give up those barrels, I think the war ends.
There's a lot of people that'll be out there, and I've already heard from some of them, Helima, that'll say, well, to heck with them. We'll just, U.S. refiners will buy U.S. shale, and we don't need the Saudis, and we don't need the Russians, and we can be independent and put an eagle on my shoulder and eat a hot dog at the baseball game. Here's the problem, is that U.S. refiners probably want those cheaper barrels that are now floating around. Right? If they're in a price war, we can buy those barrels at a discount instead of buying American barrels. Literally, for a U.S. refinery, the U.S. producers now are stuck with oil that either they can't sell, they got to put it into storage at a cost. That's why this is such a downward spiral, is it not?
Well, I think what's so interesting is we've been talking about American energy independence. Trump keeps saying we don't need Middle Eastern oil. But he's now apparently calling the Saudis saying, you know what? Could you dial back your oil price war? What's so interesting is when prices are high, we call the Saudis and say, give us more barrels. Now the Saudis have essentially given up too many barrels. We're calling the Saudis and saying, take those barrels back. And so we're not as independent as we think we are if we're consistently having to call the Saudis and try to get them to change their oil policy.
Helima Croft, RBC, spectacular, amazing insight for somebody who was on a plane in Vienna and then in Riyadh, and we certainly appreciate you coming on, Helima. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Brian.
I think, Tim, this is pretty incredible stuff that we're dealing. I mean, this is political brinksmanship at the highest level that's going to end up with 100,000 Americans out of work because of it.
Well, this has gone on for a long time, and I said this yesterday. Russia does very well in a lower oil price environment, certainly one where there's a risk off and their currency gets crushed because they're dollar exporters. They have a low cost on the domestic front. And yes, Igor Sechin, look, they put together Rosneft about 15 years ago, 20 years ago when I was living out there, and they made it a national champion, and they made it a company that really dictated political policy because there is no line between Putin and Sechin. And in fact, I won't get into that.
I mean,
it's an interesting time to be buying some of those oil companies.
And I know, and listen, I love the industry as far as the people I've met, and people, oh, now we got to buy these oil stocks, are so cheap. Here's what's hard about it, BK. We are really the only nation in the world, oil-producing nation in the world, who doesn't have one nationalized oil and gas company. Russia may have a few small ones, but it's Rosneft, let's be clear, right? We don't have that. Well, so we just death by 100 cuts.
Well, right, and so that's what's interesting about this is that the Russians apparently have a long time that they can sustain these cuts. Saudi Arabia probably not as much as Russia, but they can do it. Mm-hmm. So to your point, we don't have a nationalized oil company. Let's see what the president comes up with. We might have one pretty soon.
But this is a strategic industry for our country, and they will be protected somehow, and they should be.